About 6,000 years ago, a completely different world emerged in southern Mesopotamia. Cities, authority, laws, and written rules regulating daily life appeared here. This world was harsh and not very friendly to people. Its gods did not promise salvation, its rulers fought for power, and order had to be constantly maintained through effort and control. Who created this world? Where did its inhabitants come from? And why did the system, which had such a huge impact on human history, ultimately fail the test? Welcome to the Amazing History channel, and today we will talk about the Sumerians. As always, thank you for being here, and special thanks to our sponsors and channel patrons. It is thanks to your support that such large and detailed videos are released. Let's go! I'll probably start with what Sumer is. It's not a state or a unified empire, as many people imagine. It's a convenient name for the south of Mesopotamia and for the culture that developed in the lower reaches of the Tigris and Euphrates, not far from the Persian Gulf. At first glance, it seemed like a perfect place for civilization. There was water, fertile soil, and open plains. But the inhabitants of the region were constantly at risk. Unlike the Nile, whose floods were regular and predictable, the Tigris and Euphrates behaved chaotically. They changed their courses, broke through dams, turned fields into swamps, and a single flood could destroy the results of generations of labor. There was another difficulty as well. The region had almost nothing convenient for building a civilization. There were no forests, which meant no wood. There was no stone, which meant no sturdy structures. There were hardly any metals or minerals. All they had was clay and reeds. But who the Sumerians themselves were remains a question. When they appear in southern Mesopotamia at the end of the 4th millennium BC, this land had long ceased to be empty. Before them, there existed the Ubaid and Uruk cultures there, with irrigation, temples, and early forms of accounting. But with the Sumerians, a language appears that was unlike any other, and this is exactly what sparks debate. Were they a continuation of the local population, or were they an incoming group that eventually became dominant? The Sumerians themselves explained their origin with a myth. They said that their ancestors came from Dilmun, a land of purity and abundance, which is usually associated with the area of modern-day Bahrain. Archaeology does indeed confirm close contacts between Sumer and this region, but the chronology does not provide a simple answer. The Sumerians appear in Mesopotamia earlier than we see their culture in Dilmun. There are many hypotheses about the origin of the Sumerians, from Asia Minor, the Caucasus, and even the Indus Valley. None of them has received definitive confirmation. To be honest, today we simply don't know where they came from. But maybe that's not so important. What is much more important is that, finding themselves in this complex and unstable world, they managed to create a system that outlived them and became the foundation for all subsequent history of Mesopotamia, and of course, eventually for us. The appearance of the Sumerians coincided with a process that can, without exaggeration, be called a turning point in all of human history. Settlements that were previously just large villages begin to turn into cities. This happens at the turn of the 4th and 3rd millennia BC. The population of southern Mesopotamia is growing rapidly, and at some point it becomes clear that not everyone necessarily has to be involved in food production. The opportunity for specialization arises. Some work in the fields, others make pottery, some trade, and others oversee the distribution of resources and offer praises to the gods. Sumerian cities immediately formed as independent political centers. There was no stable unified government among them. They had their own territory, population, economy, temples, and interests. One of the first and most prominent examples was Uruk. At the end of the 4th millennium BC, this was probably the largest city on the planet. Its population could have reached several tens of thousands of people. A huge metropolis by the standards of that time. It was here that the first truly monumental temples appeared, along with complex urban planning and the beginnings of administrative management. Along with Uruk, the most important centers became Ur, Lagash, Kish, and Nippur. Each of them developed in its own way, but followed the same pattern. The city was, above all, an economic and religious center, around which the life of the entire surrounding area was organized. At the head of the city stood a ruler called Ensi. He managed the economy, distributed resources, and oversaw construction. At the same time, he performed priestly functions, since formerly all the land and all the wealth belonged to the gods. In general, he acted as a steward on behalf of the patron deity. However, his power was not absolute. Important decisions were discussed with the Council of Elders and community assemblies. In the early period, Sumerian cities retained significant elements of collective governance, and the ruler depended on the support of the elite and the townspeople. Gradually changed this balance. In the conditions of constant conflicts, the military leader, Lugal, began to play an increasingly important role. Initially, he was chosen for the duration of a war, but over time, such powers ceased to be temporary. The Lugals consolidated power for themselves, turned it into a hereditary position, and combined military, administrative, and religious leadership in their own hands. Thus, within the Sumerian cities, a new form of power gradually emerged, which we can already call an early monarchy. And when a bunch of independent city-states emerged in southern Mesopotamia, it's clear that peaceful coexistence was out of the question. They all lived in a relatively small area, used the same resources, and claimed control over the same lands. Conflict was inherent in the very structure of the Sumerian world. This period, roughly the beginning of the 3rd millennium BC, is called the early dynastic period by historians. Ruling dynasties finally become established in the cities, and power ceases to be temporary or elective. The king is no longer just a military leader or administrator. He becomes a recognizable figure who passes power down by inheritance. Our main reference point here is the so-called Sumerian king list. This is a text that has come down to us in several copies, the most famous of which is the Weld-Blundell Prism. The document lists the rulers of various cities, starting from antediluvian times. The earliest times appear frankly mythological, where kings are credited with reigning for tens of thousands of years. But the closer we get to historical times, the shorter the reigns become, and the more often the names begin to be confirmed by archaeology. The purpose of this list was most likely ideological, to show that power has always existed, has always been passed down in a direct line, and that the current rulers are inscribed in an ancient, almost cosmic order. But for all its mythological nature, it reflects the real political picture of the era, and that picture was extremely unstable. Cities were constantly at war with each other. Alliances would form and fall apart. Sometimes one of them managed to get ahead and, for a while, impose its will on its neighbors. One of the first such centers was Kish. In Sumerian tradition, it was this city that was associated with the idea that royal power descended from heaven. Kish was seen not just as a powerful city, but as a source of legitimate authority, a kind of political reference point for the entire region. One of the few rulers of this time whose existence is confirmed by several sources was Enmebaragesi, the king of Kish. His name appears not only in the king list, but also in inscriptions from other cities, and later even in epic texts. This is a rare case where myth, tradition, and archaeology converge. However, the hegemony of Kish turned out to be short-lived. Over time, the center of power shifted south to Uruk. It was here that a new type of ruler emerged, claiming leadership over all of Sumer. In Sumerian memory, this image was later embodied in the figure of the legendary Gilgamesh. But behind the myth lies a very real attempt to turn the dominance of one city into a stable system. Similar unions emerged in other regions as well. In Lagash, rulers like Yanatum created their own alliances, subjugated neighboring cities, and secured their successes not only with weapons, but also with ideology. It was during this time that inscriptions appeared, where kings described their victories in detail, justified wars, invoked the will of the gods, and claimed to defend a just order. But all these unions were temporary. No ruler of the early dynastic period was able to create a stable state that outlasted him. After the death of a strong king, the system quickly fell apart, the cities regained their independence, and the cycle began again. And the reason is simple. Despite wars and conquests, the Sumerian cities never became part of a single whole. Each one kept its own identity, its own patron god, and its own view of the world. Subjugation was seen as a temporary disruption of this balance, not as a new normal state. When city-states formed in southern Mesopotamia, they very quickly faced a problem that could not be solved by force of arms or religious authority. This was the problem of accounting. After all, a city is not just walls and temples. It's warehouses, fields, herds, workshops, temples, workers, priests, warriors, and officials. All of this needed to be fed, supplied, and controlled. As long as society remained relatively simple, oral agreements were sufficient. But in a large Sumerian city, this no longer worked. That's exactly why writing emerged. In other words, it appeared not as a way to record thoughts, but as a management technology. The earliest forms of writing appeared at the end of the 4th millennium BC, primarily in Uruk. These ancient tablets did not yet contain myths, laws, or prayers. All they contained were grain, sheep, beer, textiles, workdays, and supplies. In other words, accounting. And at first, the Sumerians didn't. All over the Middle East, small clay tokens were used, each representing a specific item: a sheep, a measure of grain, or a jar of oil. One token corresponded to one unit of goods. Everything was extremely clear and simple, but as the economy grew, there were too many tokens, and it became inconvenient to store and count them. And here comes the first intellectual leap. Instead of storing the tokens themselves, Sumerian officials began to leave their imprints in soft clay. Now the physical object was no longer needed. It was enough to have its trace. But soon even these imprints would be replaced by conventional images, simple drawings, pictograms representing the same objects. At this stage, there were a lot of signs, thousands of them, and they still directly referred to real things. But the world of the city demanded more. Gradually, the signs began to represent not only objects but also actions, and then abstract concepts. For example, the pictogram of a hand at first meant the hand itself, but then it began to be used to represent actions: to take, to give, to do. And at this point, the accounting system stops being just a set of drawings and starts functioning as a language. And this is where the Sumerians made their major breakthrough. They realized that the sign could convey not only meaning, but also sound. If a symbol represented an object whose name was pronounced a certain way, it could be used to write other words with the same sound. That's how writing stopped being just a set of signs and became a tool for conveying spoken language with all its nuances. Technologically, all of this looked simple. The Sumerians wrote with a reed stylus, pressing it into soft clay at an angle. This left characteristic wedge-shaped marks on the surface. Over time, the images became simpler, lost their resemblance to real objects, and turned into abstract signs. That's how cuneiform writing emerged. It was a very convenient way to write quickly, in large amounts, accurately, and in a standardized manner. Over time, Sumerian writing went beyond just economic accounting. It began to be used for recording laws, religious texts, hymns to the gods, historical inscriptions, and epic tales. And that's exactly why cuneiform spread so quickly beyond Sumer itself. It was adopted by the Akkadians, then the Babylonians, Assyrians, and Hittites. Now let's talk about the Sumerian gods. And here, it's important to immediately set aside our usual image of an element or a personification of nature. For the Sumerians, gods were, above all, owners and administrators. Their world was structured just like the world of cities. Let's take Enlil, for example. He was not just the creator of everything that exists. His main function was to maintain order. It is Enlil who holds the highest authority in the Sumerian pantheon. He decides how the world should be organized, who has the right to rule, and who is deprived of that right. It's no coincidence that his main temple is located in Nippur, a city that was not the strongest militarily, but played the role of a sacred arbiter for all of Sumer. Powerful rulers tried to secure influence in this city to legitimize their authority with the gods and the people. Another example is Inanna, the goddess of the city of Uruk. She was both the goddess of love and of war. In general, she was the patroness of both sexuality and politics, political ambitions and conquests. This only seems strange at first glance. For a city like Uruk, which was constantly striving for hegemony, such a goddess was the perfect reflection of its character. In the myths, Inanna seizes power, argues with other gods, and expands her influence. In general, everything that the rulers of her city did. Or let's take Enki. He is associated with underground waters, crafts, wisdom, and inventions. But if you put aside the poetry, Enki is a god of practical solutions. In the myths, it is he who finds a way out of crises, saves people from disasters, and offers workarounds and compromises. This is very telling for a society where survival depended on engineering skills, irrigation, and the ability to adapt. The Sumerian pantheon in general is surprisingly professional. Each god is responsible for a specific sphere, like an official or an administrator. And that's exactly why the gods gather for councils, argue, make collective decisions, and punish those who break the established order. This reflects the real urban practices of the Sumerians, with assemblies, courts, and administrative decisions. Even the Sumerian concept of humans is extremely pragmatic. In the texts, people are created to work and serve the gods. They build temples, cultivate fields, and offer sacrifices, freeing the gods from laborious concerns. This directly echoes the reality of temple economy, where a significant part of the population was engaged in serving the temples and their economic needs. This is where the characteristic Sumerian view of fate comes from. If misfortune happens to a person, it is not always a punishment for wrongdoing. Often, it's just due to the gods' decisions, as they're focused on more important matters. And finally, wars between the cities. They are almost always interpreted as conflicts between the patron gods. Victory means that the god turned out to be stronger or more favorable. Defeat means that he has turned away. In this way, political reality receives a cosmic explanation, and power gets a religious justification. When the Sumerian cities finally turned into complex and hierarchical societies, the need arose to maintain order. It was necessary to establish rules, to make them clear, repeatable, and mandatory. This is how laws and agreements first appeared in the Sumerian world. The earliest Sumerian legal texts looked like a set of specific rules related to economy, debts, land, marriage, inheritance, and bodily injuries. That is, with those areas where conflicts arose most often. One of the most important examples is the laws of King Ur-Nammu, the ruler of Ur at the end of the 3rd millennium BC. His laws are considered the oldest known to us, significantly earlier than the famous Code of Hammurabi. These laws show how the Sumerians understood justice. For most crimes, the death penalty was not applied. The main punishment was a fine, usually in silver. If a person knocked out someone else's tooth, caused bodily harm, or damaged property, he had to compensate for it materially. Justice was not retribution, but rather the restoration of a disturbed balance. At the same time, society was unequal, and the laws did not hide this. Punishment depended on social status. A free man, a dependent, a slave, they all held different legal positions. In addition to laws, there were also contracts. A huge number of Sumerian tablets are contracts for the sale and purchase of land, field rentals, loans, and marriage agreements. All of this was recorded in writing, specifying the parties, conditions, and witnesses. The contract protected both sides. It limited the arbitrariness of the strong and gave the weak a formal tool for protection. In a world where personal connections and status played a huge role, this was a real innovation. Breaking the contract meant not just a conflict between people, but a violation of the established order, which was backed by the gods and city authorities. But the Sumerians represent not just the first cities and laws, but a whole set of solutions without which this urban world simply could not have existed. Let's start perhaps with the most down-to-earth thing, agriculture. One of the Sumerians' innovations was the use of the plow, which sharply increased crop yields. This meant that the city could feed not only the farmers. A surplus of food appears, and with it, the opportunity to support craftsmen, merchants, scribes, priests, and professional administrators. In other words, the plow is not just an agricultural tool, but the foundation of urban specialization. One of the most famous Sumerian inventions, the wheel, emerges in much the same way. Interestingly, it was not originally part of mass transportation. According to archaeology, the first carts were used in a ritual context to transport images of gods, priests, and rulers during ceremonies. Only later did the wheel begin to be used in everyday life and in warfare. And yes, in these early chariots, it was not horses but donkeys that were harnessed. So the Sumerian army on wheels was more of a donkey army than a cavalry. But for its time, it was still a significant technological step. The city required not only food and transportation, but also durable buildings. With a severe shortage of wood and stone, the Sumerians learned to build complex architectural forms from clay and reeds, including arches, columns, and multi-level structures. The hallmark of Sumerian architecture became the ziggurats, step temples that dominated the cityscape. The most famous of them, the ziggurat of Ur, was not just a religious structure, but a symbol of the city and its god. It was these kinds of structures that later inspired the image of the Tower of Babel in biblical tradition. The high level of craftsmanship is evidenced by finds from the royal tombs of Ur. Jewelry made of gold and silver, items made of lapis lazuli, musical instruments, intricate sculptures, and even board games. All of these were crafted with astonishing skill. Sumerian everyday life was also much more complex than one might expect. Even such seemingly minor things as soap were the result of technological experimentation. Mixing fats and alkali produced cleaning agents, though not in the modern sense. And Sumerian life is almost impossible to imagine without beer. Brewing was such an important part of the culture that it had its own goddess, Ninkasi. Beer was consumed daily. It was low in alcohol, thick and unfiltered. That's why it was drunk through straws directly from large vessels, and it was not so much a beverage as a part of the diet. Well, perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Sumerians is their mathematics and methods of measuring time. They used a sexagesimal numeral system, and it is thanks to this system that we still divide an hour into 60 minutes and a minute into 60 seconds. Dividing a circle into 360 degrees comes from the same logic. This is a result of quite practical calculations related to the earth, construction, and observing the sky. Sumerian mathematicians knew how to work with areas and volumes, solved problems that we would call algebraic today, and knew the ratios of the sides of rectangles and triangles long before Greek mathematics. Astronomy also developed not for abstract purposes. Observing the stars helped to create a calendar, plan the agricultural year, and organize rituals. The lunar calendar of 12 months was constantly adjusted by adding an extra month so as not to lose connection with the solar year. This is also where the 7-day week comes from, which is connected to the celestial bodies known to the Sumerians. This system turned out to be so convenient and stable that it survived for millennia and has reached us almost unchanged. Finally, all this knowledge needed to be passed on. In Sumer, an education system was formed. There were schools at temples and palaces where future scribes learned writing, mathematics, law, religious texts, and literature. But despite all the complexity and technological advancement of the Sumerian world, it remained unstable from the very beginning. The city-states entered into conflicts too often, not only with each other, but also with their neighbors. To the north of Sumer lived the Akkadians, a Semitic-speaking people who coexisted with the Sumerians for a long time, traded with them, and adopted their culture. And at some point this coexistence stops being equal. At the end of the 24th century, BCE Sargon of Akkad appears on the historical stage. His rise is surrounded by legends, but the result is absolutely concrete. For the first time in the history of Mesopotamia, the cities of Sumer came under the rule of a single ruler. A state emerges, which we call the Akkadian Empire. This was a turning point for the Sumerian world. The political initiative passes out of the hands of the city-states, and the Sumerians lose their independence, although their language, culture, and administrative practices continue to be used. The Akkadian state was powerful but not eternal. By the end of the 23rd century BC, it was already facing internal uprisings, economic difficulties, and external pressure. The invasion of the Gutian tribes, who came from the Zagros Mountains, became especially destructive. These groups did not try to integrate into Mesopotamia's complex administration and lacked knowledge to maintain irrigation, the region's economic foundation. The period of Gutian rule was remembered by later tradition as a time of decline and chaos. Irrigation systems fell into disrepair, trade connections were broken, and many cities lost their populations. At the beginning of the 21st century BC, there was an attempt to restore the Sumerian world. The ruler of Uruk drove out the Gutians, and soon power passed to the dynasty of the city of Ur. Under the kings of the third dynasty of Ur, especially Ur-Nammu and his successors, there was a deliberate revival of the Sumerian tradition. The Sumerian language once again became the language of administration and worship, irrigation systems were restored, and centralized power was strengthened. But this entire system, despite its outward strength, was overloaded. Rigid bureaucracy, high taxes, dependence on the center, and environmental problems, primarily soil salinization due to intensive irrigation, gradually undermined it from within. New external pressure was added to this. From the west, the Amorite tribes were growing stronger, and from the east, Elam was advancing. And at the beginning of the 20th century BC, the combination of all these problems led to a catastrophe. Ur fell, central authority collapsed, and the unified state disintegrated. For contemporaries, it looked like the end of the world. The surviving texts are full of lamentations for the destroyed cities, describing what happened as a moment when the gods turned away from people and the order of the world was disrupted. From this moment, the Sumerians disappear as an independent political force. Their cities come under the rule of new dynasties, their language is gradually displaced from everyday life by Akkadian, and their culture dissolves. Sumerian writing, religious beliefs, laws, and scientific knowledge continued to live on in Babylon and Assyria, and through them in much later traditions, through which they reached our world. Well, that's all from me. Thank you for watching and see you in the next episode. Goodbye, everyone.